I am the chess strategist, and today we're going to win another chess game. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of our Rapid Speedrun. In the last game, we played the Italian. Our opponent launched a strong attack against us, but we were able to punch back with a strong counterattack, and we were able to win the game. So today we're going to look to do something similar. We're going to play very solid chess, we're going to develop our pieces, and we're going to have a good time. Our games have been getting a little bit more difficult. Our opponents are a lot stronger now that we've climbed the rating ladder a little bit. And we're trying to see how we stack up against them using our own openings, our own strategies. And we do get the white pieces today against Rundronix. Good luck. We're going to play e4 as we always do. And our opponent goes with e5. Our opponents on this website love e5 more than anything in the whole world. It's not the only response to e4, but we're going to continue with our same response, knight f3, attacking the e5 pawn, and our opponent goes with the most common response, knight c6. Now there's a few different ways to play. We love our Italian, but I think I want to go for something different. Let's go for the Roy Lopez, also known as the Spanish opening, which starts with bishop b5. Now, at the highest level of chess, between grandmasters, this is the most common move. Opponents love to play this opening. It's a very, very topical opening at the highest level. Okay, our opponent plays this d6 move, which I believe is called the Steinitz defense. It is not the most popular, but it is very solid. So, one way to play this is to just castle. And that's what we're going to do, castle kingside here. And the plans in the Roy Lopez are kind of similar to the Italian. You want to play c3 and d4. You want to play h3 to disallow this bishop from coming to this square. Your knight might reroute like it does in the Italian. So the Roy Lopez in the Italian, of course there's a lot more theory in the Roy Lopez. A lot more positions that everybody knows, but there is a lot of similarities between these openings. So I'm going to play c3 here. I feel like c3 is a nice move. Preparing d4. And our opponent's knight is pinned. So there's not really a good way for him to reinforce this square immediately. And here our opponent attacks the pawn on e4. So we're just going to defend it with our rook. Our rook wants to be on e1 anyways. And here let's calculate and see if we can play this move d4. d4, pawn takes, and our knight is defending, our queen is defending, and we can get away with it. So let's do it. d4, we strike in the center. And a lot of the times when you're able to play d4 in the Roy Lopez or the Italian, you start to have a small advantage. Now here our opponent does pin our knight, which can be problematic. But here it's not too big of a deal because we can first start with this move, knight to d7, or not d7, knight d2, sorry. And he can take, but we take back. What we are a little bit worried about, though, is him then taking with the pawn, take, and then takes like this. So there's a few different ideas here. One, we can advance our pawn to d5, which I'm liking. Let's just advance our pawn to d5 and not worry about this pawn being weak. And here we're noticing our pawns are kind of going towards the queen side. Pawns towards the queen side is a very interesting idea. We don't have to play on the king side immediately. We can start attacking over here on the side of the board where we have the pawns controlling a lot of squares. This square is now becoming very strong for us. Our opponent is less likely to play this, and he's going to have a weak pawn if he decides to play any of these moves. So I'm really not very worried about a lot of our opponent's threats in this position. Let's see, where do we want our bishop to go? Our dark square bishop could go out to g5, but I would be worried about discovered attacks. But here it doesn't work. Bishop g5. Then what we could do is, if he takes here, we could just take. He's forced to respond, and then we just take back with the rook, and we're up a piece. So I'm liking this move, bishop g5. An idea that you have to be familiar with is exchanging your bishop for a knight. If the knight is a very strong piece, it can be very much worth it. Positionally, we see our opponent has a lot of his pawns on dark squares, and this dark square bishop is kind of a weak piece. I don't really think that this piece is all that great for black. So we don't really mind exchanging our dark squared bishop and leaving him with this poor dark squared bishop. So one idea that I have is to just exchange our bishop for this knight and allow us to have more control of the light squares in the center of the board. These are the squares that we want to control. We want, especially the d5 square. This d5 square is an all-important square for us. So we're going to see this positional idea. It's present a lot in opening like the English opening, where you're playing specifically on the light squares mostly, and you want to have control over the light squares. So what you do is you give up control of dark squares in exchange for control of light squares. Here, I think that's an excellent idea. We don't have to rush, though. The one thing we don't want to allow is our opponent to play this move d5. What that would do is eliminate their weakness in the center of the board, which is this pawn. So what we're going to do is exchange pieces immediately. And then we're going to knock this bishop away. Knock it back a little bit. And of course, if he takes, we can take with the queen, and we'll continue to still have more control over this square. Nice. Okay. And we want to notice where our knights and rooks and all of our pieces want to be. Where do our pieces want to be? Well, this knight could develop here, but I'm going to be afraid of allowing this advance to d5. We don't want to allow the advance to d5 at any point. One thing we could do is play c4, but that would give our opponent this nice square on d4 for himself. We want to make sure we control our square that we want to control, but we don't allow him to have the square that he wants as well. One thing I like here is just developing our queen. How do we want to develop our queen? Well, we can lift our queen. Lifting our queen is kind of a good idea. Lift it to d3. Continue contact with the knight. We don't want our opponent to double our pawns. And we're also allowing this knight to start developing as well. And we can also put a rook on d1. That's the eventual goal, is we want to get our rook on d1. And we're seeing also that we have a few other ideas in this position as well. When you have a square like this that's very weak, you want to use it as an occupation square for one of your pieces. You want one of your pieces to stand proudly on that square. Now, which piece is going to go on that square? Well, it's probably going to be this knight. How are we going to get the knight there? Well, there's the typical routes, d2 to f1, and then up to e3. And then from e3, we can access both of these squares. So I'm liking this move, knight d2. Now, of course, this e3 square is temporarily going to be unavailable for us because we need to keep contact between our queen and the knight here. So we're going to drop our knight to f1 for now. And I'm noticing here there's a few different tempo moves that we can play. Now that we've vacated this d1 square, we can put our other rook on it. Why is that good? Well, it's good because we're going to be creating an immediate attack on the pawn, and our opponent is going to have to defend that pawn. Now, the other thing we could do is we can notice that this knight isn't really doing that much on this square anymore. And we might want to move it to a different square and play a move like f3. That's another idea that we have in this position. But let's just start with rook d2. I like our knight there. Our knight is, for now, pretty much fine. We can always play g4 if we really want to, but I don't think we need to. Okay, so our opponent decides that he wants to advance his pawn. We can knock our bishop back. Our bishop wants to be controlling this square, and we wanted to play it to this nice diagonal anyway, so I'm liking the idea of keeping our bishop on c4 or dropping it back to b3 if we have to. Here our opponent decides to advance his pawn again, so we just drop our bishop back to b3, where it's slicing through the center of the board. And here our opponent still has kind of failed to defend the pawn, and he's going to have to find a way. And there's not too many great ways of defending the pawn here. Alright, and here he decides to exchange his bishop for our knights, which is a great trade for me. I like that trade. We're still controlling this square. We have this uncontested light squared bishop, and he has a very poor dark squared bishop. Alright, and now I'm seeing that we have sufficient control of the center of the board, and we are going to have very strong pieces as soon as we start developing them to those excellent squares. So the first thing I'm noticing here is we can start going with our plan, knight to e3. That's an excellent idea. And we're noticing that this bishop that we purposely left on the board, we said to our opponent, hey, you know, this bishop is not a great piece. We don't need to worry about it at all. And we're seeing that's coming true. This bishop is just sitting here being blocked by his own pawn. He's restricting some of our access to these squares here, but these squares are not that important. Our bishop, however, is piercing through the center of the board, pinning this knight to the king, and it's allowing all sorts of nice moves. For example, if our opponent decides to attack our queen with this move, we can drop our queen back over here, and now this knight really doesn't have a nice square to go to. This knight is kind of stranded because if it drops back, you're going to notice that this square is not being defended by the pawn because of the pin. So there's all sorts of threats that we're starting to have, and our pieces are starting to be positionally a lot more well placed. So this queen g3 move is a move that I'm highly considering in these kind of positions. Alright, and we see here our opponent decides to occupy the outpost f4. f4, which is an interesting outpost for a lot of reasons. It attacks here, and we're trying to see what our opponent's idea is. Of course, we don't want to play g3 and knock it away immediately because we would blunder this pawn on h3. We don't want to allow that. So what I'm proposing is we decide to develop our knight to a nice square, and our knight can occupy the symmetrical outpost f5, where it's attacking the pawn. It's attacking this weak backwards pawn in the center of the board. It's also creating pressure here, and it's just overall being a nuisance piece. When we drop our queen over to g3 here, we're also going to be creating a threat on the g7 pawn, and his bishop is going to have to stay on this square. This bishop sucks on this square. We want to keep it there as long as possible. It's basically just a pawn. I mean, it's obstructing the f-pawn's movements. It's obstructing the coordination between a lot of his pieces. His queen can't get to the king's side because of that bishop in the way. So keeping that bishop there by any positional means is an excellent idea. Okay, and we see he moves his bishop because he thinks it's terrible on that square too. And we can, of course, take it with the knight, but why would we want to give up our amazing knight for his absolutely horrible bishop? I mean, that bishop is still terrible. It's just defending. That's all it's doing. And here, I'm seeing the immediate move, queen g3. I think this move is excellent. And there's not that many things he can do. First of all, we're creating the immediate threat of knight g6, and we also have the threat of queen takes g7, checkmate. So he's going to have to defend against both of these threats. The other thing is he can't respond with the move g6 because we can just take. If you notice the pin here, this pawn is pinned to the king, so this pawn isn't actually defending this pawn if he advances to g6, and that would be checkmate in 2. So we're starting to see here our opponent's pieces. This knight, while it is on a nice square, it isn't alone enough to create enough threats against our pieces. But we have the knight placed on an excellent square, ready to attack. We have this bishop creating the pin on the pawn, and we have our queen laser beaming this g file and creating the pin on the g pawn. So both of these pawns are pinned, and there's just too many weaknesses in our opponent's position. Okay, so our opponent drops his bishop back, and here he's decided he needs to defend against this threat on the g7 pawn, which would be checkmate. So I completely understand him doing that. In the process, though, he's allowed us to, first of all, we can take this pawn with our rook or our queen. Rook or our knight. Or we could take this pawn immediately with check. The one move I'm liking is just the immediate rook lift up here and taking the pawn with tempo on the queen. We also are attacking the bishop, which is not even being defended by anything but the queen because of the pin. So we're just going to take with the rook here, and this rook is becoming another excellent piece. Now we have another piece in the attack. It's attacking the bishop. The queen could take, yes, and we would have a queen for a rook, which is an excellent exchange, so we're not worried about that. And we're starting to see that our pieces are overwhelming our opponent, and his position is busting away at the seams. We have so many different ideas here that we can go for, and our opponent doesn't have too much of a response. Now, when you're winning like this, you need to be very careful about threats that your opponent may make. Now, our opponent has allowed us to take the bishop for free, but one hasty move someone could make is, say for example, they could lift their other rook over to d1, and they want to make sure that they have full control of their d file, not realizing that you actually allow a fork of your queen and king there. So you need to see threats like this, and notice that this rook, while it's not looking like it's doing much, is being very important. It is defending this pawn, and it is also defending this very weak e2 square. But anyways, our opponent has blundered. They've allowed us to take their bishop, and our opponent cannot take because it would reveal the queen's attack on the king. So in this position, our opponent is again being threatened with checkmate, because there's so many threats here. The main threat is this threat on the g7 pawn, and there was not really a great way to defend it. But here our opponent has allowed us to play queen takes g7 checkmate, so we're going to take, and that's checkmate. And wow, we played a very clean attacking game. We won in 25 moves here. Let's go over it. And I'm going to be a little bit more thorough with the analysis now. We've gotten into very interesting games where our opponents are playing well. They don't play dumb moves, but they do still make mistakes that we need to cover. So start with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and we decided to play the Roy Lopez. Now, the Roy Lopez is a very well-explored opening. There's a few different responses that are the main responses. Knight f6, which is called the Berlin, is the main response at the highest level, and there's also a6, which is called the Morphy defense. So both of those moves are very popular. But our opponent played more of a sideline, which is d6. Now, d6 has a few pluses and minuses. The first minus is that it opens up the pin. So now this knight is pinned and it can't move, and there's less options for the knight. The good thing about the side knights, though, is your e5 pawn becomes incredibly well defended, and you have this nice pawn chain. The other downside, though, is that this bishop is now blocked. This bishop it's going to have a hard time developing, and sometimes in the side knight's defense, you want to play d5 eventually, and then you're going to be able to develop your bishop to a strong square, or you can also fianchetto your bishop, where it will eventually be on the long diagonal influencing. So There was a few different ideas in the Steinitz to get this bishop active, but our opponent really didn't do any of them. We decided just to castle, which is not the best move. Knight c3 is the most active, strongest move, but we played castles, which is fine. Opponent developed his bishop to e7, and the computer says that d4 immediately would have been a strong move here, exploiting the fact that our opponent has not developed the knight and created an attack on the pawn yet. But we decided to play c3 and then d4 after we played rook e1. We wanted to get our pieces developed, and then we broke open the center with d4, and it was the best move when we played it as well. Our opponent played bishop to g4, which is a strong move, noticing that this pawn is being attacked twice and defended 3 times, but if he took here, we'd be forced to take with the pawn, because if we took with the queen, he'd have 2 attackers, and we'd only have 1 defender. So he's trying to win the pawn in the center of the board by pinning. We decided to advance, which wasn't the best move, but it was an option that I really liked. First of all, it forced him to undevelop his knight. And second of all, it made him go for this break c6, which I don't think was a great move in retrospect for him. I think it says that it's pretty much even still, but it allowed us to have this nice outposted square d5, and we were able to go for this positional move, bishop takes f6, and we saw that this bishop on f6, while you don't want to give your opponent the bishop pair a lot of the time in chess, here it's completely warranted because we are focusing on control of these light squares, and by giving up our dark square bishop for a knight, we're increasing our control over the light squares. Our opponent has 1 less piece that he can use to defend this d5 square, and that was his best placed piece, I must say. His knight on f6 was creating a lot of pressure on our pawns and this square that we want to control. And we noticed from here on out, we were able to develop our pieces a lot more actively and get just overall better pieces eventually. We saw this knight reroute trick that we always do, knight f1 and then knight to e3 or g3. And we got our bishop to the diagonal that it wants to be on. And he took, giving up his last chance of having a light squared bishop. And so now that his light squared bishop is gone, this light squared bishop is going to be uncontested. And as you can see here, there's a lot of uncomfortability in this position. First of all, this bishop is very awkward, but it needs to be there. It's blocking the queen's influence over this f7 square, and this rook, if he moves his bishop, this rook is never going to be able to move. So this bishop has to stay here pretty much. And here the engine starts to really like our position. Engine says that we're getting close to winning here because we have just better pieces. And our development is simple. Knight to e3. He puts his knight on the outpost, but we occupy the other outpost. And our opponent has a hard time defending this pawn here. The prudent move would have been advancing the rook to c6, but our opponent doesn't see that idea. And we see the idea of lifting our queen over to g3 and creating an attack on this pawn, creating a pin on this pawn as well. So we're threatening this move here, which we didn't go for in the end, but we could have gone for. And here he drops his bishop back to the square it was on. We see that he's kind of aimless. You know, when your opponent's repeating moves like that and they're defending, they're obviously kind of lost. So we see the killer move, rook takes d6, forcing the queen to move away. And the engine actually says that taking the rook is the best that black can do. Taking this rook is important because there's no other way for this bishop to be defended. So wow. He could have taken, or actually a computer likes king h7 as well. But yeah, still giving up the queen is... This shows you how dire this position is. The opponent must give up the queen in order to be able to continue the game. So he moves his queen over, and we see the move that just ends it all. Rook takes f6, and g5 would have been a better try, but our opponent decided to play king to h7, which allows mate in 1. So, what did we learn from this game? Well, we need to pay attention to positional factors. We noticed that the squares in the center of the board that were exploitable were these light squares. So we saw how can we get more control of the light squares, and how can we trade pieces favorably for us so that our opponent can't control the light squares. And that's where this trade on f6 comes in. And a lot of people, when they hear that the bishop pair is an asset in the position, they never consider a move like this. But when you see the overall goal in the position, it becomes a lot more clear of what pieces you want and what pieces you don't want. We want this light square bishop. We don't need our dark square bishop as much. It's not going to do as much. We want our knights to be controlling these squares from e3 or g3, or we want them to be on the squares. And we want to trade. We want to get rid of his light square bishop so that our light square bishop is uncontested. So we were able to accomplish our positional ideas, and from there, we had a lot easier time creating an attack because the weak squares in the position were able to be used by us. And as soon as we got this knight to f5, our opponent had a very difficult time dealing with all the threats we were able to create. Our pieces all attacking, creating pins, creating uncomfortability in the position. It's really all that our opponent couldn't really deal with it. So yeah, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this game. I feel like it was very well played by us, and I was able to explain to you guys the methodology for a lot of my moves. I hope you're able to incorporate some of these into your own chess games. And yeah, I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. Have a good one.